Alrighty, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG. Today we are going to be looking at something pretty amazing, and that is the evolution of a monster. The very concept of being a storyteller and game master means that you have to draw in your players with something that they can fight. And the concept of role playing games, as we know them today, actually derived specifically from the indiscriminate slaughter of monsters. And we are going to be talking today in particular about one that is near and dear to my heart because I have actually observed over the 50 years I've been a storyteller the gradual elevation and eventual almost relegation of the species to unprecedented heights. And it's a story of redemption and a story of accident. And so as we go into this, make sure if you haven't yet, like and subscribe, hit all the buttons down below. That really helps the channel. And also make sure you get a chance to watch the other videos at NycosRPG on YouTube. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the Rook. And that is a term that may not be familiar to you, but you have heard the origin of the term, the concept of the classic orc. Dungeons and Dragons did a fine job of collecting that species from their original sources with Tolkien, and of course the term had a much older reference to those who were unknown or oppositional to certain cultures, and came to be defined as unworthy, unruly, irredeemable, and flat out monstrous. And so today we're going to be looking at how that changed over the time from my beginnings as an 11-year-old game master throughout the many years of storytelling and the iterations of Nikos as they happened. As you may know, when I started storytelling, I developed a story that took about 6 years to build, and in that period of time, I created an arc that would be repeatable iteration over iteration. And so we are now in the 9th iteration of the world of Nikos, and each step of the way, the orcs, and for that case, most of the species of Nikos have gone through iterational changes and elevations and failures as well. And we'll go into all of that. All right. So at its core, when you are a 11-year-old kid and you're playing in a fantasy setting, and the storyteller describes um, the bad guys, they describe them in uncolorful terms and unkind phrases. And the orcs from the very beginning were really considered to be unredeemably bad. If you were going to try to fix something, you would not be able to do so with the orc. If they were disagreeing with you, they would be disagreeable. It just, their very nature, in terms of being an 11-year-old, was that they were the unconscionable, the people that you would never in a million years even attempt to negotiate with. You just simply would destroy them. And we see this in motion pictures, such as when we talk about the destruction of the Sand People in Star Wars, and other worlds where we don't actually talk about the awareness of them as a species. Instead, we have created them as the other, the opposition, the enemy, those who should be destroyed. And we don't question it because in game terms, we have to have, someone to blame. We have to have someone to point our fingers at and say, if we destroy them, that fixes our situation. And furthermore, the very concept of the orc, as described even in Tolkien, talking about their snout-like faces and tusks and bad aromas and all of the bad things. Anything that could be held as a positive was basically eliminated from the concept. And when you are setting up games to kill monsters, you're not thinking about what the lifestyle is. You're not talking about the population, the culture, the ethics, nothing. You're just, going to set up something to knock down. And orcs were very handy for that. And in the first iteration, in the first few years of my game mastering, there was no question. You could just chalk them up as one of the species to be knocked down. Now, from a literary standpoint, the Uruk Hai are described in specific terms as being a hybrid between goblins and men, and it was kind of murky and dark in its perception. But in the mind of a young reader and a person who was running role-play games, the Uruk Hai was an evolutionary step. It was an advance, if you will, on the crude, rude, and socially unacceptable orc. The idea of the Uruk Hai, therefore, were your elite bad guys. Yes, they were still on the bad guy side of the line, but there was a problem. You see, the role-playing mechanism Dungeons and Dragons included a couple of race choices that were, let's just say, questionable. At the time, they weren't. At the time, no one thought about it at all, because there was certainly motion pictures that had used the idea of half-breed species or half-breed individuals. And of course, there was a lot steeped in what is now considered to be racism, and it was almost always couched in negative terms, but there were still those who were, as persona, playing the bad boys and wanted to have these rather darker backgrounds. But it was a problem for me as a human being and as a game master, and so I elevated the part of the species of orc to make them more acceptable and more negotiable, I guess, so that you could have situations like the half-orc species or the half-elf species. Now, I thought it was fascinating that the rules only went in certain directions, but that was, I believe, more to do with the direction of literature at the time. There were books about characters like Marrukh Half-Elven, and the idea of persons who were of multiple species to get some of the edges and benefits of that species and still play into the plight or negative connotations that the author was trying to promote into his persona. And the differentiation, therefore, the concept of the Uruk Hai become a matter of recognizing that there needs to be a connection to the species for that to occur, but it also needs to be able to be dissociative. You need to be able to disconnect from it so that you can continue the very process of destroying the monsters, defeating the bad guys and such. And so this dissociation meant that the Uruk Hai had to be unrelatable. Their culture, their language had to be undefined, had to be identifiably different enough from the orc to make it so that you didn't question the destruction of the bad guy. But it was also had to be justifiable. In other words, if a person was playing a half-orc, there had to be at least some way to redeem or recognize the value of the parents to make the story make sense. and therefore their lives had to be justifiable. Furthermore, the Uruk Hai, they were the elite, they were the bad guys, and so the idea, therefore, is that even the Uruk Hai could be laudable, maybe not in an individual case or even in a collective case, but still recognized for their prowess, their adventuresomeness, and ultimately they need to be, at least some form, the ability to be heroic, because that would be associated, therefore, with the class, that would be the race choices of the players, and therefore they began to evolve. Now, this evolution of the Uruk Hai was more in terms of making the bad guys better at being bad. It wasn't a immediate flip-flop, so to speak, but it was the idea that the Uruk Hai were different from standard orcs. I moved. The camera angle changed on me. That was very strange. Sorry about that. The elevation of the Uruk Hai was also associated with something else that was going on, and that was I was in school and we were starting to develop knowledge about deeper subjects. This was in my earliest, my mid-high school classes, when we started taking classes on Western civilization, and I had a broadened bibliography. I had read the majority of classic science fiction and fantasy, from Ursula Le Guin to Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, Ray Bradbury, and so on and so on. This broadened bibliography meant that I had a higher vocabulary, and therefore had more words to use to describe things. And so I changed the Uruk Hai to the Rukh. And partially this was done because of an appreciation for chess and that piece's stalwartness and toughness, and representing that in the role-playing game as a bad guy who was a worthy opponent suddenly brought all of the orcdom, all of the orc type. It was like a rising tide that raises all ships. They lifted the orc off the ground, so to speak. Now, there's actually a bit of fun here, and that is that I put here player prying. The reality is that game masters and players have always had a competitive, if not adversarial, positioning within role-play games. And so it was because players were digging into my notes in between sessions that the term Rook actually took. Players grabbed a hold of that and realized that I was using chess annotation in one of my notebooks to refer to the orc strategy, and therefore they became collectively known as the Rook that way. But the tide here also changed the very concept of the species. Until Western Civ, I started understanding how cultures advance by literally running over each other, and how to the victor go the spoils, and the what's the other phrases? The victors are the ones who write the histories. This concept that what was always all bad may not be, led to a real problem with the game in this term, because as I added the term Rook and elevated the species, I had to differentiate from them those who were actually playing with the half-orc and the half-elf and things like that. And so culturally, the games group that I was working with, we started to adjust and shift this so that the Rook and that therefore the half-Rook and the half-elves were no longer fundamentally appealing. Now, there was also a rules change in the game that had made it so that you could kind of handpick what species and what race you wanted to be. It was no longer roll the dice and decide what you're going to build from the numbers that you rolled. Instead, you were filling out the sheet the way you wanted to, and therefore it became less palatable to play the half races anyway. But the real problem was that the race rules were flying in the face of actual science that we were learning in school. And so the concept that the speciation would have occurred at some point in the past, and therefore they were no longer able to be equitable for that purpose, changed the way we played. We didn't have anybody playing the half species. Almost everybody's playing a specific, class or certain culture. But I also have to credit David Brin. If you haven't read any of David Brin's fiction work, I would highly recommend it. He's done some really great works. There was a series called The Uplift Wars that he did that were really exemplary. But they talked about the fact that a species could be uplifted, that you could take a being type that had not developed its own sentience and push them over that limit and give them the opportunity for sentience. And so it makes for a great story and a great series, but it really did influence the way I looked at the different species. So as this change occurred with the Rook, so changed the way we played them, because now they were a rational species. They had the same drives and interests, and perhaps different in terms of their motivating factors, but generally they were now a reasonable culture that you could actually communicate with, which made challenges more Byzantine, because you couldn't just kill them. You were looking at another culture and how they looked at justification and law and rationalization, and it changed the way we played. All right, so now we're going to talk about maintaining necessary evil. When you look at role-playing games, when you look at any combat-based game, the evolution of the game changed over time. Originally, it was about the adventure of knocking down doors, taking the monster's treasure and whatever. And some people stuck with that. That is where they see Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing even today. But the evolution of RPGs marched on as players became more sophisticated and the stories they wanted to tell became more intriguing and interconnecting. They no longer required the life sacrifice, if you will, that had to occur in the combat kind of games. And when you play a role-playing game and use combat as your gauge, you have to keep supplying something for the bad guys and for the good guys to battle. You have to have something that they can engage within the rule set, and therefore you have to either constantly come up with new creatures, new challenges that are physical in nature so that you can keep feeding them, which is great, I suppose, if that's what you're looking for. If combat is your gauge, then that's the way it has to go. But what I discovered in the storytelling that I did is that my player demand was for there to be some form of necessary evil, something needed to stay the bad guy no matter what. So even as the Rook were elevating and being perceived as heroic and brave and dangerous and all the kind of things, they also became more sophisticated. And by that I mean that they were no longer fighting for just taking land or raiding or whatever. They were actually supporting their culture's advancement, looking for ways for their own future. And I think this really affected the way I run all of my games, because when you are looking at your non-enjoined players, the what people call NPCs, they need to be living beings. They need to be fleshed out to some extent so that you understand why they do what they do. And without that, you would end up with a kind of a flat experience, which I think a lot of people have. That's why the concept of NPC has gone beyond the standard role-playing audience and into public awareness. But I think that did a disservice to roleplay as well, because that meant that the normal, mundane, and common were uninteresting and unworthy of humanity to be involved with. And I think this actually led to what we now consider to be a positive thing that in the past was absolutely negative. The concept of optimization. In this framework of time, we're talking about in the early days of Dungeons & Dragons 3.0, 3.5, leading towards the fourth edition. The idea of optimizing your player to reach certain objectives and get certain triggers used to be considered bad pool. The idea of min-maxing or finding ways around the weaknesses in a character, thereby obviating the bad things and making all the acceptable things more valuable or whatever. But the process with optimization was itself an evil. And I think that, at least in my case, the idea of the Rook staying bad had to require them to constantly be, for lack of a better term, victimized. And so the concept of the Aurrukh and the Marrukh were rising tides culturally, but they were also being suppressed politically. The very nature of the game required good guys to go out and punch orcs in the face. That was just the way it went. And I think the term orc also was not as marketed as it could have been in the past. And so the idea of the orc fell out of favor. As a matter of fact, they remained in the monster manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide and such, but they were not considered to be as favorable an enemy any longer, because they had, even in the general population, become a culturated species. So now we come to the more recent iterations, 6, 7, 8. The concepts of the Rook have now adapted to be two separate species. Genetic drift being what it is, there are some cultural and physical differences between them now, but they are still fundamentally covered under the umbrella of the Rook. The Aurrukh, which come from their name derived from them being the golden tide, or the using the Latin aurum for gold, the golden tide orc. The Aurrukh are to this day standard raiders, standard nomadic tribes. They tend to raise spiders, monstrously large and dangerous spiders, as their herd animal, as their beast of burden, and tend to prefer the open spaces where those spiders can range. And because of that, they don't tend to cross too many borders and get involved in too many conflicts. While they are culturally savvy and could be elevated once again to be a species of consequence, the 6th and 7th iteration, they were pretty much ignored because they were no longer considered to be a threat. Since their raids were localized and the story tends to be globalized, there wasn't as much focus on them. Likewise, the Marrukh, fundamentally those of the Rook tribes that were eventually driven from the shores of land, learned to survive on the seas and developed large, basically sea hulks, these monstrous wrecks that have been hodgepodged together and remain barely afloat and act as their cultural bases. And while they do occasional coastal runs, for the most part, they have been involved in operating in a seagoing life and have not been engaged with. It's only in this last iteration that we're starting to see new changes. And if you want more information on those, you definitely want to keep in touch with our campaigns. So now we come down to the end of the matter. We are looking at, on Mondays, the different species and the way they've evolved over the iterations. We will be looking at perhaps any species that you're interested in. If there's any particular kind of being you'd like me to do a report on, I'd be glad to do that. The World of Nykos is a 12,000-year story that was 50 years in the making. I've been GMing since 1974, and I'll be glad to converse about any of the species in the world of Dungeons and Dragons and or in the world of Nykos. If you are not familiar with Nykos, check out NycosRPG.com for information on the property itself. And if you want lore about the world, you could definitely watch all the videos that I've done here on YouTube and on Twitch, as well as look into NycosRPG.info. That's my World Anvil page and has a considerable amount of lore pieces. They're in bits and chunks because it's not as organized as I would like it to be, but it will give you some idea. For more information, of course, about our games, we do play at a board game store in Redlands, California, Mondays and Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Pacific time. We also run 2 live stream games, so if you want to support this project and become a part of our community, check out our Patreon site, patreon.com/Nykos, and get information on the developing process. We will be in the near future developing the Kickstarter for the NycosRPG, but we want to thank you for being a participant in this episode. Thank you for being here. If you want more information, let us know. I'll be glad to talk with you, and I will see you again the next time.